The hallmark of a Rousseauian system gone out of control is the scramble of different government officials to try to become the mouthpiece and hand of the general will. Hey everybody, I've been talking about Rousseau and Locke a lot recently, especially Rousseau. I've been going through his social contract book and trying to understand the differences between it and the Lockean system, right? The idea being that a existing government that exists in real life can kind of go from a limited, at least, ideally limited perspective of a Lockean system into a Rousseauian system. It's very hard to tell where that line is. But something that I saw a couple of weeks ago in a Brian McClanahan episode, or Brian McClanahan show episode, kind of made me start thinking about this and start thinking that maybe the best way to look at the difference between a Lockean system and a Rousseauian system is this idea of someone being the mouthpiece or the hand of the general will. So a couple of weeks ago, there was this Brian McClanahan show episode where he's talking about a Jonathan Turley essay, which is in turn about Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson and her recent dissent in the case that the SCOTUS dealt with about, it's basically about nationwide injunctions being handed down by district judges. Now, Jackson wants district judges to have this ability to put forth these nationwide injunctions. And of course, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for a district judge to have nationwide powers. One of the points of having districts is that you end up with different districts having opposing rulings, which then is a way to say, oh, this issue is contentious, and therefore maybe this is something that should go to the Supreme Court. Instead, we have these, district judges basically passing these nationwide injunctions, and there was a decision that went against these nationwide injunctions where Justice Barrett said this, quote, she said that Ketanji Brown Jackson's dissent is, quote, at odds with more than 2 centuries worth of precedent, not to mention the Constitution itself, end quote. Now, Jonathan Turley is a writer who is on the right. He basically says that what Ketanji Brown Jackson is trying to do is to replace an imperial presidency with an imperial judiciary. He kind of ignores the problem of an imperial presidency because he's currently on the side of the president. But it's worth noting that the president has been imperial for a very long time. The first significant, really big example was probably John Adams and the Alien and Sedition Acts. But there are plenty of them, across the board, right? We have Lincoln turning the Constitution into a suicide pact. We have Roosevelt saying that because he's elected by the people in general of the nation, that he represents kind of the general will of the people, and therefore he should have a lot more power. It's an awfully convenient argument for him. What's happening is something that we observe in a Rousseauian system, but not so much in a Lockean system. In a Lockean system, at least ideally, there is a written constitution that determines the laws. There is a separation of powers that determines what each individual branch of the government does. There are limitations on the power of government, for instance, right? There are things that the government cannot do. If we look forward a little bit, we can look at Mises' perspective on the proper role of the state, right? The proper role of the state is fairly similar to a Lockean system, only Mises goes so far as to say that no legitimate government, that a legitimate government will allow economics to proceed in a laissez-faire state, because the consequences to not assuming a laissez-faire position by government are disastrous. In Rousseauian systems, the government has unlimited power, but it uses a lot of the same language as this classical liberal system that Locke and his successors kind of built up. And the reason for that is because what Rousseau is trying to do is to create a hazy line between a totalitarian government and a government that is at least in principle limited in some ways. Of course, what Rousseau's push into a totalitarian government does is it leaves different officials, presidents, etc., Ketanji Brown Jackson in this case, scrambling for imperial powers for themselves, and other activist judges in this case. A Lockean or a post-Lockean system creates a judiciary to interpret laws. There are different ways to do this, but the best ways are to look at what the law meant when it was passed, and failing that, you can at least look at the text of the law to interpret what it means. Judges have jurisdictions, and there's a reason for judges to have jurisdictions. It's so that you can produce, or at least look at different, look at the law, have different people look at the law in different ways, and then bring these basically jurisdictional conflicts into a later application to an overall ruling, right? There's kind of a reason why we have the possibility for these jurisdictional disputes. In Jonathan Turley's essay, he looks at another one of Jackson's dissents a little bit earlier in the term, and he notes that she's urging against textualism. She's basically saying, well, we shouldn't be so married to looking at what the purpose, what the law is written as, or what it originally meant. We should be doing what we think is right. And this sounds very much a Pied Piper kind of situation, because this kind of follow your heart judiciary is basically unlimited power and a path for bad actors to be put into positions where they're completely unaccountable. Remember that the purpose of the judiciary is to interpret the laws, not to enforce or create them. And Ketanji Brown Jackson's idea that, well, the judiciary shouldn't really worry about what the law says is completely at odds with the Lockean perspective, or the post-Lockean perspective, or even the constitutional perspective that the purpose of the judiciary is to interpret law. So this is what you expect when a Lockean or post-Lockean government kind of moves into the Rousseauian regime. You get this mad scramble where everybody wants to be the one who speaks as the general will, but nobody wants the personal accountability that their decisions might have. Right? The executive, of course, is always accountable. There's always the president to be like, well, he said this, and he enacted this policy, and therefore we're going to target him. But it's way better, and it's way more handy for totalitarians to find positions that don't have that kind of accountability. For example, legislators will often avoid accountability by moving their lawmaking ability into, say, executive agencies. And those executive agencies are run by bureaucrats who are just looking at rule books and applying the rules. They don't have any personal responsibility for anything they've done. They're not even following orders. They're following things that have been written in a book. That's one step further away. They don't have any individual responsibility. Then we have the judiciary, which loves to avoid accountability by, number one, by using increasingly opaque legalese to kind of justify their positions with a burst of hard-to-interpret language that they can interpret in any way that they want. Or they use appeals to emotion. They say, well, the law says that this is a crime, but this person, I don't think, deserves the kind of punishment that the law prescribes. This is the kind of thing that leads to the judiciary having a lot more power than it ought to have. It's worth noting that the more unaccountable the government is, the less likely it is to actually serve the people. Remember that this was Locke's ideal, government as a servant, as an agent. In Rousseau's case, Rousseau says the government should serve the people, or the sovereign, but the sovereign itself is some kind of weird, ethereal pullout from all of the different people into its own kind of fictional body that Rousseau maintains is not actually fictional. It's worth noting also that whereas a Lockean government is supposed to limit itself to natural law, or if we look at the Misesian perspective, it's supposed to limit itself to, the very bare minimum minarchist kind of things of enforcing contracts, reducing aggression, that kind of thing, and not supposed to regulate the economy, for instance, that a Lockean or a Misesian liberal, classical liberal government has limits, whereas a Rousseauian government has no limits. But it's important to remember that the language that the government uses in the general case in the Lockean or Misesian or in the Rousseauian system is very similar, and therefore a government can move from this classical liberal case to a totalitarian case where it has no principled limits on its power very easily, very imperceptibly. One of the things that we perceive when this change happens is precisely this desire to be the mouthpiece, the voice of the general will. How do we avoid this? Well, we avoid this with laissez-faire. We avoid giving the government unlimited power to determine what deals people can make between each other in voluntary cases. We limit the government specifically to looking at cases where someone claims I have been forced, against my will to do X or to do Y, and we have the government look at those cases specifically. That, of course, is a band-aid. It's not a perfect response or a perfect solution, right? The pure voluntarist solution is that we only operate on voluntary agreements, on voluntary contracts. We ensure that these contracts have some particular structure, right? That for instance, no single side of a contract is also the interpreter and decider in cases of conflict on that contract. There are certain requirements that a contract has to have in order to actually be voluntary, and this is one of the things that the social contract fails. But in the end, the thing to remember is that the more power the government has, the more likely it will harm the people. And this fight between different officials to get that power is also a source of more kind of a ratcheting up pain inflicted on the people that are forced under a government. Right now we have, imperial presidency and a legislature that has delegated most of its lawmaking powers to unaccountable bureaucrats, and a judiciary that instead of interpreting the law wants its justices to follow their hearts. And all of these are a recipe for lawlessness, and lawlessness in the wider sense, where there will certainly be laws, but they certainly won't be enforced well, and they certainly won't be enforced equally among people. I'll put links to the description to the Brian McClanahan show episode that I'm talking about, and also to the Jonathan Turley essay. Brian McClanahan is a pretty good source for thoughts on like states' rights, or rather state powers, and federalism, as opposed to the kind of nationalism that a lot of people who called themselves Federalists were in favor of. Jonathan Turley appears to be a writer on the right, and so his preference for Trump over Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson is kind of understandable. I don't know enough about him to give a pure evaluation of his positions, but he is definitely further out on the right, and so take what he says with a bit of a grain of salt. But his essay was still pretty good, and it did have some good quotes in it that I think are worth looking at and considering at least. So anyway, that's what I've got for today. Hopefully you found this vaguely interesting. Yeah. I mean, a lot of people give up on learning about these old kind of structures and stuff. Like they don't care about differentiating between Locke and Jefferson and Rousseau and Marx, right? People put all these things together and just say, oh, the government should do good things. And one of the points that the classical liberals were at took pains to describe is why it is important for governments to have limitations, and not just limitations right now, but limitations in the sense that they can never do X, Y, Z, A, B, C. Mises took this to the bare edge of anarchism, and so if you're not quite there yet, then it might be worth reading Mises to get a feel for his position on that. But the point is, and Mises is very clear about this, the point is that whenever the government starts to intervene, it creates more problems than it solves, generally speaking. And so, yeah, that's what I've got for today. As always, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you want to help out the channel, if you like what I'm doing, there will be links in the description for that as well. And of course, you can always go visit my blog, and there will be more stuff to do there. Have a good day, everybody, and enjoy the start of your week.